Cool. So Nick, yours is an interesting one. It's always such a difficult one, especially for landlords that have multiple properties, and especially with landlords that use caretakers to take care of their properties. And you often find this in like buildings where, again, multi-let, student accommodation, that sort of thing. So it ties in quite nicely. It ties in quite nicely to our conversation. So in this particular case, there was a gentleman that was staying on one of the properties, and he was offered a reduced rent, provided that he fulfilled the function of a caretaker. Now, the property's been taken over by a managing agent, and this managing agent has indicated that they no longer need a caretaker. And the question by this tenant is, well, what do I do? Because it sounds like they still want to continue doing this job and want to continue paying the reduced rental, but they're asking what now happens to the lease agreement based on the fact that it had a reduced rental in it.
Perfect. So, as Bruno pointed out, this happens every now and then where people have owning property, and you've got someone who manages, or you want to use them for a particular function, and as part of that particular function on a premises, you offer them a reduced rental of some kind. Okay, we've seen many things like caretakers, security guards. These are things that people enter into, within society. Now, what's important when it comes to cases like this is to remember that where you are engaging someone in a particular way where they're going to perform certain acts for you, okay, it is generally what happens within our law is you're creating some sort of contract which may fall outside of a particular lease agreement, okay. We obviously advocate here highly that people use, professional lease agreements that are done. Lease agreements are going to set out the obligations and the rights of the particular parties. And in general, unless you gear your lease agreement to include these particular functions that they're going to perform, your lease agreement is going to be absolutely silent. Okay, so a general lease agreement is not going to say you're going to perform the functions of a caretaker, this is what you're going to do, and you're going to receive a rental remission for those amounts. And in fact, most lease agreements, if you guys are using substantive lease agreements, are going to say that the terms of your lease agreement are the entire terms agreed on between the parties, and nothing else that you agree to is enforceable unless it's reduced to writing and signed by the parties. Okay, so what's very important in respect of this is when you enter into other agreements with parties and they're going to perform certain functions, you may be in a position where you're not actually amending your lease agreement in any particular way. But what you are doing is creating some other form of contract between the parties which has its own rules, obligations, etc. Okay, and in our particular case, you might be creating an employment contract between the parties. Okay, so you think, okay, he's just going to do a little bit of, one or two things for me and he gets a rental remission. That's great, but it doesn't affect your lease agreement. Your lease agreement might be completely separate, and now you've created an employment contract between the parties. And you need to be very careful about doing something like this, because employment law in South Africa has its own rules, its own obligations. Anyone who's employed someone before will know there are serious consequences for employment contracts and serious obligations that the parties have in respect of employment contracts. So and those particular rules have to be complied with by themselves. Okay, it's no good looking to the lease agreement and just saying, well, the lease, governs this relationship. No, you're going to have to comply with labor relations and with labor law in the circumstances. So to bring an anecdotal sort of example that Bruno and I were discussing just before this, you can have a situation where someone is in a situation where there's a caretaker, that employment relationship comes to an end, and if you try and evict the person from the premises, you can get caught up in a situation where the court says, but no, we can't evict them, because now you have to deal with the labor side of the relationship between the parties, and has that been done properly? Has the termination of the employment contract, in fact, been done properly? And that can hold up your eviction proceedings. So that's just an overthought to say, please be careful about forming these types of relationships. If you're going to have certain obligations in terms of your lease agreement, remember, you can always amend your lease agreement to include terms like this. Absolutely perfect, but make sure you do it correctly. Make sure you do it in accordance with your clauses of your lease agreement, which allow for this kind of relationship. Unfortunately, for the writer in, he's basically said, look, this was the relationship that he had in the circumstances. And now his services have been taken away. I'm not sure whether this is something that was actually catered for within his particular lease agreement or not. That's something that would have to be looked at. Okay, but on a face value situation, it looks like, look, if the agreement between the parties was you get a reduced rent, you have to perform these certain functions, and those certain functions are no longer applicable. If I'm taking it from a purely, let's look at it as a lease agreement situation, it looks like then your rental is due to increase. But as I've said, there's much deeper questions with regards to this question, and we don't have all the facts of the particular question, whether this formed part of a lease agreement, whether this formed part of an employment contract, and what the consequences of that particular situation are. So from a cursory view, I'm going to say, unfortunately, it looks like if you're no longer performing the functions that were expected of you before, and you're obviously no longer entitled to the rental remission that was granted to you previously, and you'll obviously just have to pay that increased rental.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Awesome. Thank you so much, Nick.
Perfect. Thank you, Bruno. And we will see you again next week.
Awesome. Have a great one.
Yes.